Hey everyone, welcome back to Verified Gains. I know I just made a video yesterday, but this is an emergency video, so it's a must-watch video. It might run a little longer today, but please pay attention and let me know, down in the comment section below what your thoughts are. So, yesterday, right? Just yesterday, the US government announced its direct involvement in Iran. Now, this is a huge news because a lot of people were weary, with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, whether US was going to get directly involved. And they just announced that, they completed 3 strikes on nuclear facilities in Iran. And people are very much worried. And I think it is showing on the Bitcoin price chart, this morning. So, if you look at the chart right now, we actually, came down from 102 to $100,000. I don't know how much we're going to pull back here. Our next support line is at $99,000. So is it possible that we go down to that level? We'll see. But, you know, if you were waiting on the sidelines, going cash heavy, I'm going to provide a little insight as to, whether, if I were you, whether it would be a good time for me to dollar cost average. So we must first, go back to our basics. So I know, look, today it's going to be a little more macro heavy rather than technical analysis. But, whenever something major like this happens, paying attention to the news, the political climate, the macroeconomics really does help us guide in terms of how we can, potentially not exactly time the market, but determine when it's generally a good time to buy in. So, so let's start from the aspect of global economy. So what's going to happen? Well, Iran is a major oil producer. And so if there's any conflict or any sanction that disrupts the supply, it can definitely lead to a spike in oil prices. And a lot of that has to do with, you'll hear people talking about, 20% of the global supply of oil through the Strait of Hormuz and so on and so forth. In any case, the point being, if we do see higher oil prices, then it's very possible that we see a global inflation, higher interest rates, and slower economic growth. Now, I'm going to come back to this concept because it largely does tie in with what I was talking about yesterday, which is, the Fed's decision to hold the interest rate steady. And that is going to be a key point of this conversation, so I'm going to come back to it towards the end of the video. Okay? All right. So, then in general, what are people going to do? How are people going to react, especially the retail investors and traders? Well, they're going to tend to flee to safe havens like gold, US dollar, US treasuries, and shy away from risk assets. And what are some risk assets, right? So mainly they're stocks, especially small cap stocks, tech stocks, and growth stocks. They could be possibly, speculative properties, commodities, junk bonds, emerging markets. And then, the one thing that I, think is sort of a gray area is cryptocurrency, right? Like, for example, let's say Bitcoin. Some people say, they're safe haven assets, hedge against inflation. Others may argue, no, it's actually a risk on asset. And so, right now, the Bitcoin price dropping is that a reflection of people's perception that Bitcoin is still considered a risk on asset? Or is it temporarily a transient pullback and then ultimately this whole conflict is actually going to propel Bitcoin's price to the upside because it is considered a safe haven asset. I mean, that is actually the $1 million question. And so, now let's shift our focus to cryptocurrency. Um, it's hard to say based on past data whether, conflicts in general lead to the general exponential movement during a Bitcoin bull cycle top. I mean, some examples might be, one example might be the Ukraine invasion, which happened, early 2022. But by that time, the 2020, 2021 Bitcoin bull cycle was largely considered over and entering the bear market at that point. So it's hard to say, in recent times whether there's any substantial evidence to say that, okay, well, some like war or conflict is going to increase the Bitcoin price exponentially. However, in general, and I don't want this to sound like some conspiracy theory, but part of me also thinks that maybe part of the U.S. government was reacting to the Fed's decision to hold interest rates steady. So, you know, somebody maybe at some point was like, oh, the federal chair is going to hold the interest rate steady. Okay, well, we're going to then be involved in, um, you know, okay, maybe that's a reach. Okay, maybe that's going taking this a little too far, but it's very possible that whatever the case is, this direct involvement in the Middle East, US's bombing of Iran, at the end of the day is going to be the what I call this a black swan event. But in any case, it certainly is a significant event. And is this perhaps going to convince the federal chair to lower interest rate as soon as possible? And, that is the big question. And just going back to crypto, how does this really affect Bitcoin's stance as a global currency? Now that even for Iranians, for example, if they have limited access to international banking, are the citizens and businesses going to turn to crypto for cross-border transactions? So now they're going to rely more on these types of digital currency that basically could be transacted globally um, as a form of currency, and that is very possible. And if that is the case, that would also be a factor in terms of contributing to Bitcoin's price to the upside. So right now it's a little bit of a gray area, but if you're a Bitcoin bull like me, for example, you know, it's very unfortunate, by the way, anytime conflict arises, right? So whether I don't think there really is a right or wrong side, to be honest. Anytime there is conflict involved, it's just unfortunate. But that said, you have to pick and choose, right? So you have to say, okay, well, if I'm just focusing on cryptocurrency, like basically I'm a robot, I'm an AI machine, and I'm just focused on Bitcoin's price and its future. Well, if you're a Bitcoin bull like me, basically, I think this is somewhat bullish for Bitcoin actually overall. Um, Now, and the reason being, apart from what I mentioned previously, I really do think that Bitcoin, Ethereum, and even altcoins are actually safe haven assets. I believe they will ultimately take advantage of this conflict and go up in prices. And especially for altcoin, one argument is, they are risk on within risk on asset. Um, and, it's hard to really actually say they are, um, safe assets. They're mainly speculative. But guess what? I mean, it really also depends on the type of altcoin that you're talking about. But if you're talking about a meme coin like PopCat, there's no business or no, financial model that is based off of, meaning that, there's no utility. It's really based on hype. And people actually may choose to say, you know what? If the economy is going down the drain, then I might as well park my money into a meme coin like PopCat. Now that sounds crazy, right? But if you were to just think of PopCat the same way that you would with Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Solana, I mean, one argument that you could make is at the end of the day, it's not really impacted by oil prices or conflict around the world. Because does that really kill the hype? Unless people think that, you know, um, it's an asset based off of like an actual company that has a utility, and you know, and that is based on like true growth. So not just the price going up and down, but there's actually a structure and actually a business model, like Apple or Google, where um, it is considered like a growth stock, but people are now shying away from that because they rather be safe and risk and are adverse to risk of losing money, and they're not as interested in making more money through growth stock during these troubled times. And I just don't think meme coins operate the same way. I think people should treat meme coins the same way they do, US treasuries or gold, which is actually kind of crazy to say out loud. But, the fact of the matter is, I mean, why would PopCat be affected? Why should Solana be affected by what's going on, uh, in the real world? Um, so anyways, just going back to, by the way, that little bit was kind of a crazy thought, but I mean, you can kind of tell how much of a, bull I am when it comes to Solana and PopCat. Um, so anyways, going back to the federal interest rate, what do I think should happen? I think overall, I'm very curious as to what the oil price is going to be come tomorrow when the markets open back up. I do imagine that it will soar. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it soared into the triple digits, like above $100 per barrel. I'm also very curious as to how the US dollar is going to react to this. Now, likely what's going to happen is it's probably going to go up, which historically is, inversely correlated with Bitcoin price. So, if I were to make that argument, then it's really not looking good for Bitcoin. Okay. But in the coming weeks and coming month, I feel like this is going to be the catalyst um, for, and the reason for the Fed to react to this. And I think ultimately they are going to decrease the interest rate, which ultimately is going to increase Bitcoin price. And if Bitcoin does well, then all the altcoins are going to do well. So ultimately, I think it's going to be bullish. Anyways, please let me know in the comments down below if you agree, strongly agree, or absolutely disagree, and what I've just said is absolute, BS. But please let me know because I like to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, a lot of people are worried, but I'm also curious as to, what you guys think because obviously you guys are watching this video, and especially for my subscribers, I know you guys are, you know, interested in Bitcoin, Solana, and PopCat, and that's why you guys are subscribed to my channel. So please, I would like to hear some input. Maybe I'll learn from you guys. But, the reality is, right now we're sort of in this gray area where it's a lot of unknown. And Bitcoin could either tank, but in my opinion, I think it's going to do well overall. So am I dollar cost averaging? Yes, 100%. Okay, Solana right now retesting $126. Definitely buying in over here. I mean, why wouldn't I? PopCat, another red day. I woke up this morning, I already bought some PopCat again. I'm not scared. I'm not scared. I think this is the catalyst. And I could be wrong big, but if I'm right, I mean we're going for the big gun, okay? We're going for the big gun this year. Anyways, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening in. It was an extra long video today, but there's a lot to talk about and discuss. Anyways, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.